Warmly welcome to this roundtable event on delivering the European Green Deal towards a coherent and integrated EU ocean policy framework for offshore renewable wind energy and biodiversity. My name is Thorjørn Larssen. I'm a Deputy Managing Director at the Norwegian Institute for Water Research, NIVA. I'm also a leader of something called the European Topic Center on Biodiversity and Ecosystems. That is a large consortium working in partnership with the European Environment Agency, supporting EA on delivering on their data streams and assessments. So I will be moderating today's roundtable. The roundtable is hosted by GreenDeal-NET and arranged by two EU Horizon Europe research projects called PermaGov and CrossGov. We will soon have introductions to those two projects by the project leaders. As you all know, the European Green Deal comes with a comprehensive set of objectives and targets relevant and important for the oceans. Implementation of this is, of course, very challenging, and one of the reasons is that the current governance landscapes are multi-sector, multi-level, and complex. So in today's roundtable, we will discuss the role of policy coherence and institutional integration for delivering the Green Deal, with particular focus on offshore wind and biodiversity. So we will start with an introduction, a brief introduction to the first results from the two projects, CrossGov and PermaGov. Both projects study how to navigate the complexity of marine governance under the Green Deal. So after brief project introductions, we will have introductions from a panel of policy officers from different parts of the European Commission and from an NGO, followed by a discussion and a round of questions also from the audience. So with that, we are ready to start, and I will first like to invite Judith van Leuven to present the PermaGov project. Judith is an associated professor at the Environmental Policy Group at Wageningen University. Judith, please.
Okay, yeah, thank you, Thorjørn, for your introduction, and I'm happy to present indeed to introduce, to kick off the roundtable with the introduction, and within the introduction to tell a little bit about the work that we have been doing under the PermaGov project, and after my part, Fraukje will follow with explaining a little bit more about what the results are within the CrossGov project. As a general introduction, Thorjørn already referred to it, both projects look at the developments in the EU Green Deal and the developments around marine governance and how the EU Green Deal is changing governing activities at sea and impacts on the marine environment. And the EU Green Deal is, of course, an ambitious set or vision. Actually, it starts with a future vision for the European society. It's ambitious in nature, and although it's focused on the EU society, it of course also has implications and deals with issues around the marine environment and activities that impact the marine environment. So just a couple of examples of the types of ambitious targets that are set under the EU Green Deal. There are, of course, the climate targets. Those are very much prominent in this future vision. But to achieve those climate targets, there are concrete targets to expand offshore wind capacity from 12 gigawatt to 60 gigawatt to 300 gigawatt by 2050, for example. In addition, there are some targets around creating a network of protected areas, not just on land, but also at sea, which should cover 30% of spatially. But there are also, of course, targets around protecting birds and habitats. So there are different targets, and today we will discuss more of them. But the point is they are ambitious, and in order to achieve such ambitious targets, both projects, PermaGov and CrossGov, work with or depart from the fact that in order to achieve and implement measures to achieve these objectives, marine governance itself needs to innovate, it needs to change, it needs to improve, it needs to be able to actually set those measures and achieve and implement them to achieve EU Green Deal targets. So part of that is to improve collaboration, to improve the coherence of within marine governance, especially across different sectors and different issue areas like wind energy and biodiversity, to integrate activities and policy making for different issue areas, so that there is a possibility to achieve those targets. Now, this is not easy. Marine governance, of course, is not something that comes out of nowhere. There are already institutionalized, as we call them, or routinized practices of collaboration, of decision making, of implementation. So changing that in a relatively short time span that the Green Deal has put in place with targets for 2030 and then 2050, that's quite a challenge. We also recognize that there are institutional barriers, as we call them. So those are barriers that come from different rules, procedures, both formal and informal. So the norms that already exist about collaboration, about which issue areas are more or less dealt with separately, or where collaboration already has emerged. We need to better understand these barriers, but we also need to look at how coherent policy making has been in the past, because a lot of the EU Green Deal relies on existing directives and regulation that the EU already has put in place, which are currently being amended and revised, and keeping or ensuring that these developments happen in a coherent way, so that there's no disjointed between different issue areas is also important. So that's the starting point for both projects, which are funded, of course, by the Horizon Europe program. I will now continue to tell a little bit more about a tool that we have developed as part of the PermaGov project, and it's a tool, we call it the diagnostic tool, to identify and to show how institutional barriers emerge. We call it a simple diagnostic tool. I will come with a disclaimer immediately after explaining the basis of a diagnostic tool, because it's not simple. You can find the report in which we introduced the diagnostic tool, or especially how we developed it on the PermaGov website. So I've added a link here. And the aim is to help both researchers, but also practitioners, to identify how governance issues and institutional barriers are linked to what we call institutional attributes. And institutional attributes are basically characteristics, governance characteristics that emerge out of these institutions, so the rules and procedures in place. And we have three types of institutional attributes. So we have institutional attributes around the characteristic of the institutions in terms of, for example, at which scale they are, at the EU scale or more nationally, how rigid they are, how formal they are, and what kind of incentives for participation they create. And then we move into the second category that are about these incentives for participation from different actors and stakeholders. So there are specific rules and procedures around eligibility of actors to participate, different roles and responsibilities they have, what kind of resources they have, and what kind of power and control they have over decision-making processes, accountability of actors, and the connectivity between actors. And then we have a third set of institutional attributes around more procedural, also in nature, when it comes to conflict management and development and use of knowledge. So a wide variety of potential institutional attributes or existing institutional attributes that, of course, are changing now also under the EU Green Deal. That already makes it more complex, but the idea is that these identifying these attributes can help to also identify the barriers and undesired governance outcomes, for example, lack of institutional integration or policy incoherence. So it's not just the attributes that are important. Actually, what we have observed is that different attributes can become barriers. And this is where it becomes more complex, because some attributes will be perceived as a barrier, but some will actually act as an enabler. Or are just there. And so when an institutional attribute actually becomes an institutional barrier, that's more difficult to say. And then what kind of governance effect those barriers have, and how it becomes undesirable in order to achieve the EU Green Deal objectives, but also to prevent change within marine governance. Yeah, that's another step in sort of identifying how institutional barriers lead to undesirable governance effects. So we work with these three components, and to make it then even more complex, what we've also observed is that resolving one barrier can tackle multiple governance issues. So there's also there are relationships between institutional attributes and barriers and how they lead to governance issues. So it's not one institutional attribute or one institutional barrier that sort of prevents institutional change and integration to happen. It's actually multiple together. So it's a complexity of different attributes, barriers, and therefore undesirable governance effects or outcomes, or at least lack of progress, you could say. So that leads me to how to use the diagnostic tool. We will, of course, use it in the project. We are currently using it to identify the institutional barriers within different domains. One is marine energy and one is marine life. We have different case studies within the 4 issue areas that we focus on. So that's pending, that's a future outcome. But like I said, we also hope the diagnostic tool can be helpful for practitioners, for policymakers. That means that it's not about only identifying, but also assessing the impact of these barriers. What is the governance outcome or the hampering effect? What is the barrier? Why is the barrier? And to what extent is it a priority to achieve the Green Deal objectives, for example, around offshore energy and protecting marine biodiversity, but also recognizing these interconnections. So it's more than just recognizing the institutional attributes. It's also what impact they create and how multiple barriers actually may reinforce each other. This then requires more in-depth knowledge of governance dynamics and institutional attributes. And that means that people, if you use this diagnostic tool, also for us within the project, we need to go deeper, and we need to, which also takes time. We need to talk to different stakeholders. So also in using the diagnostic tool, I think it's not something you can do on your own. It has to be part of a collaborative process, actually, with different perceptions and input that together can then help reflect on the governance dynamics that currently are going on and how that's changing and how that's linked to institutional attributes, sometimes some of which are already long in place. And it also requires doing this every now and then. So the continuously refers to the fact that this is, of course, there are always changes going on. So that means that you do it once and you react to what your outcome, you can resolve some things, but then new barriers can, of course, emerge again. So yeah, that's a little bit of insight into the first tool that we have developed, the applications to come. So watch out for that. And I hope that today we can discuss already some of these institutional barriers when related to marine energy and biodiversity. So I will now give the floor to Fraukje to tell a bit more about CrossGov and their outcomes. So I need to stop share. Yes, thank you.
Yes, thanks a lot. Is my screen in full screen? Yeah? No?
It's a presentation mode, so you need to, yeah, exactly, swap it.
Okay, good. Thank you, Thorjørn, and thank you, Judith, for the introduction. So in CrossGov, we work more specifically with policy coherence, and we evaluate policy coherence, and we also try to foster policy coherence within the marine environment. And this is very much needed because, as we heard, the Green Deal sets a lot of ambitious goals for the marine environment and the coastal areas and the marine areas. And as these are very ambitious, we need to question actually whether we do have the laws and policies in place to actually achieve all these ambitions. But another question that we need to explore is whether the existing frameworks, whether the existing laws and policies are actually sufficiently coherent. Because the field of marine law and governance is very fragmented, it's complex, and unfortunately, it's not always coherent. There are certain inconsistencies, there are mismatching requirements that can make it more difficult to implement all policies equally well. So very often we find ourselves in a situation where we have to make trade-offs and we have to make decisions in which we have to prioritize certain interests over others. And for realizing the Green Deal, this is a problem because the Green Deal itself, it requires progress within many policy areas at the same time. So climate change, offshore wind energy, biodiversity protection, green transportation, zero pollution, and so forth. So in CrossGov, we try to focus on policy coherence and explore how coherence can help realizing multiple objectives at the same time for ensuring synergies, for ensuring win-win outcomes. So we look into the policies and the landscapes, and we look into the implementation of these policies to actually explore where the challenges are. But in addition to this, we also try to develop a methodological framework to evaluate policy coherence more systematically and more comprehensively. So the CrossGov Policy Coherence Evaluation Framework is a methodological framework that is fit for policy design and policy implementation phase, and fit for horizontal coherence assessments, as well as vertical coherence assessments up to the Green Deal. And we make a distinction between assessing the level of policy coherence by looking into the objectives of policies, the instruments of the policies, like the measures, the requirements, the mechanisms. And then we look also into the factors that can explain why there is low or high coherence in a particular field. And then we have designed specific criteria to help us evaluating, and specific guiding questions that can also make these evaluations a little bit more systematic. And then we have a very simple scoring approach with guidance that helps to visualize the results of the evaluation. So when we look into the policy coherence attributes, for instance, we evaluate whether these are aligned in terms of substance, in terms of geographical scope, timelines, monitoring, reporting requirements, other kinds of mechanisms. And for the explanations, we look into 3 broad categories. And the level of coherence can sometimes be related to governmental structures, like the mandates and the roles of authorities, the resources available, power dynamics between certain authorities and sectors, but also issues related to data and knowledge often affect the level of policy coherence. Problems related to data fragmentation, data integration, or the lack of knowledge itself. And then we look also into the involvement and the role of certain stakeholders and actors that actually affect how the policies are formulated and how they are implemented on the ground. So we are currently applying this framework in our own project, and we are developing it further and preparing it for external use by others. So we are working on making it into a user-friendly format in the coming year to be disseminated. Now, one of the policy clusters that CrossGov is working on is offshore wind energy and biodiversity. And as Judith explained, the Green Deal has quite ambitious goals for both biodiversity protection and the production of offshore renewable energy, including wind. But there are some challenges if we want to achieve them both, because offshore wind installations, they can disrupt the life cycles of fish and other marine species. Another challenge is that wind turbine parks, they need considerable space. And the best places are often in these shallow banks, which also are biodiversity hotspots. A third challenge is that we still lack quite a lot of knowledge on the effects of offshore wind installations and infrastructures on marine biodiversity. And finally, there is still uncertainty on the legal status of the MSFD goals and objectives, which affects how these are considered when wind parks are becoming a reality and when they are going through these kind of application processes. So the big question is actually whether the policy landscapes and the governance arrangements around offshore wind and biodiversity are actually sufficiently coherent and sufficiently integrated. And very simplified, we could say that the protection of marine biodiversity is regulated by the nature directives and the Marine Strategy Framework Directive to ensure that we protect marine biodiversity. Then we have the climate law and the Renewable Energy Directive, which regulates renewable energy, including offshore wind. And we have Marine Spatial Planning and its directive, and that aims at the coordination and co-location, but also promotes economic growth. Now, offshore wind projects, they may affect sea floor integrity, which is a key element of the MSFD's good environmental status requirements. There is a general prohibition within the Nature 2000 network to have any kind of projects in Natura 2000 areas. But according to RED, the Renewable Energy Directive, offshore wind projects are automatically exempted from this prohibition because such projects are considered to be of overriding public interest, for which the Habitat Directive can make an exemption. Now, marine spatial planning could be used to coordinate. However, it also explicitly promotes economic growth in the maritime sector. So the question is whether marine biodiversity is currently well enough protected. And we wonder whether the nature directives and the MSFD are actually strong enough to protect the marine environment from offshore wind pressures. And we also wonder whether biodiversity concerns are integrated well enough into climate and energy policies. So with these questions, I would like to conclude our introduction, and we're looking very much forward to hear from our four speakers who are actually experts in marine biodiversity and the MSFD and renewable energy, as well as the Marine Spatial Planning Directive. So thank you very much.
Thank you also to you, Fraukje. I've actually, since I know you, you're a colleague at the Norwegian Institute for Water Research, where you are a senior researcher. So I forgot to introduce you properly, but now I did. Thank you both for those introductions. Scientists asking difficult questions. Luckily, we have now a nice panel of people working very closely with policy implementation and development. So without further ado, we move on to the first introduction from our panelists, and that is Eloïse Couffon. She's from DG Energy. She will talk about offshore renewables and their role linked to tackling climate and biodiversity crisis. Eloïse, please.
Many thanks, Thorjørn, and good morning, everyone. Can you see my screen? Just checking that it works.
Yes, working fine.
Perfect. Well, thanks a lot for inviting me today to share the perspectives from the energy side on how to tackle the energy transition and the biodiversity crisis as a single challenge. As you know, offshore ambitions are set to play quite a significant role in the energy transition. We've mentioned objectives a few times already, but indeed it plays an important role in reaching our climate objectives, so notably a reduction of 55% greenhouse gas emission by 2030 and climate neutrality by 2050. But it also plays quite a significant role in ensuring EU energy security. And this was highlighted by the Repower EU Action Plan, published in 2022, and which is basically EU's reply to the impact of Russia's unlawful aggression over Ukraine on the energy market, and which basically highlights the role of offshore renewables on reducing our fossil fuels dependency on third countries and for minimizing future energy prices risks. And then, of course, we have the Renewable Energy Directive, which we've mentioned already, and under which co-legislators agreed last year to reach 42.5% by 2030, with the aim of achieving 45% of renewables by 2030. And indeed here, offshore renewables again play quite a significant role. So in the European Commission, we've been promoting the role of offshore renewables for several years now. It, of course, comes back to before 2020, but I would say that 2020 was quite a milestone because we published the first EU offshore renewable strategy, which basically provided momentum for deploying offshore renewables in the EU with ambitious EU objectives of 60 gigawatts by 2030 and 300 gigawatts by 2050. So I will not go into the detail of this strategy for the sake of time, but basically it aimed at establishing a strong and predictable legal framework, the enabling investment conditions for deploying such offshore wind ambitions, strengthening the supply chains, supporting innovation, and working regionally to achieve those ambitions. So since 2020, we have achieved quite some progress already. And last year, as part of the wind power package, we decided to publish a communication on achieving our renewable offshore ambitions to basically take stock of the progress achieved so far, look at the challenges that still lie ahead and find the levers to address those. But this communication was also a way to reaffirm the Commission's commitment to offshore ambitions, and namely to the ambitions established by member states at regional level in 2023. So indeed, last year, member states committed to ambitious offshore goals. This is a result of new provisions that were undertaken at EU level under the Trans-European Network for Energy Regulation, the 10E regulation, which entails new provisions for boosting the deployment of offshore renewables through planning for offshore at EU and regional level. So one of these provisions is actually that member states have to agree regionally per sea basin level on offshore renewable ambitions by 2030, 2040, and 2050. And the first edition of those ambitions was published last year in January 2023, and they will basically be updated every 2 years. And so in January 2023, we saw that member states agreed to achieve more than 110 gigawatts by 2030 and roughly 320 gigawatts by 2050. So this is actually more than what we had expected at EU level in 2020 when we look at 2030, because we had initially envisaged 60 gigawatts, as just mentioned. Today, we are roughly at 20 gigawatts installed across the EU of offshore wind. So there is quite a lot of work to be done if we want to achieve these ambitions. And the industry really has to move at full speed. Roughly, we have to install around 12 gigawatts per year. So this is in 2030, this will be 5 times more than what we have installed today, and in 2050 it will be 50 times more. So quite a lot and very ambitious. And of course, we know that such massive deployment of offshore wind turbine may have some environmental impacts on marine ecosystems and biodiversity. I'm sure experts here in the call are way more aware of this than I am and have more expertise. Some of these environmental impacts are listed here, but we also know that offshore wind turbines can have positive impacts on biodiversity as well. And from the energy side, we try to promote these solutions where sometimes offshore wind turbines can actually act as artificial reefs for biodiversity and as a marine environment to foster the recovery of some ecosystems. So now what do we do to ensure that we can actually foster the deployment of offshore, which is massive, and to make sure that we protect and try to improve marine biodiversity. So we have a number of nature protection rules, which were already mentioned by colleagues. We also have published in 2021 a Commission guidance to help navigate through this nature protection legislation for offshore wind and wind deployment as a whole. And now, since last year, we also have agreed under the revised Renewable Energy Directive for member states to actually identify areas of renewable acceleration. So basically, member states have to designate by 2026 areas for renewables deployment of one or more technologies. So it can be offshore renewables, but not necessarily. And basically, these areas will ensure that the renewable energy sources developed on these areas are not expected to have a significant environmental impact. So it, of course, builds on maritime spatial plans. And those member states whom have already allocated offshore renewable deployment areas in their MSPs can use those for the renewable acceleration areas, but it also supports member states who haven't done so in their MSPs to come forward and allocate space for renewable offshore ambitions, sorry. We have published a guidance on Monday to help member states and to support them in designating such areas. And we will work in the coming months and until 2026 to do this. Now, I just want to focus on maritime spatial planning, because from the energy side, we really think that it's a key tool to ensure that we have sustainable coexistence of all users, including offshore wind and nature protection. And here, the communication from 2023, which I referred to, is really clear. We need to strengthen maritime spatial planning, especially through regional cooperation, to make sure that we have good planning and a coherence between all offshore ambitions for each of EU sea basins. So what we are doing under the offshore strategy is first that we try to work with member states and regional organizations to move from purely national MSPs with cross-border consultations to regional MSP planning. Second, we try to support member states for addressing the effects of offshore renewables on ecosystems and biodiversity, including with regards to cumulative impacts. And third, we work with member states to include areas for multi-use when revising their national MSPs. As I'm sure you're already aware, some member states are currently revising their maritime spatial plans to accommodate first these new offshore ambitions, but also to accommodate new objectives under the 2030 biodiversity strategy, which I'm sure my colleagues from DG ENV will talk about later. And in the context of this revision, we really try to work with member states to ensure that they regionally cooperate to allocate space for offshore wind. And how do we do this? Well, of course, through regional cooperation. And from here, from the energy side, the main tools that we have is the high-level groups, high-level political groups per sea basin that are established under the 10E framework. So basically, these are political high-level groups for the North Sea, the Baltic Sea, Southwest Europe, and Central and Southern Eastern Europe. In which member states, but also stakeholders such as transmission system operators or other stakeholders, discuss and work together on a variety of topics related to energy at all levels, so from ministerial level to technical expert level. And in the North Sea and in the Baltic Sea especially, but also in other high-level groups, there is quite a focus on offshore wind, of course, and quite some work on maritime spatial planning and offshore wind. For instance, in the North Sea high-level group, which is called the North Sea Energy Cooperation, we have quite an established structure with some support groups, one of which is actually dealing with maritime spatial planning and offshore wind. So this creates a strong link between MSP experts and energy experts, and puts all of the North Sea countries at the same table to discuss these two topics in a single forum. And the support group also provides quite some technical work, for instance, on cumulative impacts, on spatial studies, looking at offshore ambitions up to 2030 to 2050, also discussing on multi-use, etc. Under the Baltic Sea, we have also quite a strengthened cooperation with strong cooperation between the Baltic Sea High-Level Group for Energy, which is called BEMIP, and the HELCOM VASAB working group working on MSP. Another important aspect, which I think is crucial to ensuring that we tackle both the energy transition and the biodiversity crisis at the same time, and this has been mentioned already, is of course early, regular, and meaningful stakeholder engagement. And here, on top of all the EU legislation that we have established last year under the Grids Action Plan a pact for engagement to ensure that we have sustained dialogue with all stakeholders when planning and building offshore grids, and ensuring that stakeholders are included from the outset of planning and projects. And last but not least, because I feel that I'm too long already, apologies for this. I just wanted to quickly present the offshore network development plans, which are a new tool that was published last year under, again, the new provisions on offshore under the 10E, and whereby basically ENTSO-E, so the European Network Transmission System Operator for Electricity, has been tasked to establish some plans at sea basin level to give an overview of what would be the infrastructure needed offshore to achieve the offshore ambitions. So they have published the first edition of those plans early this year in January. You can have a look on their website. It's all available. And basically, they provide high-level information on where corridors of projects are expected to be built to reach those ambitions, the length of offshore infrastructure that would need to be built, the costs that it represents, and also the amount of gigawatts that need to be built annually at sea basin level. So I think this is quite an important tool. Of course, it builds on MSP, on member states' MSPs, when those MSPs allocate space for offshore wind. But I think it's also an important tool and important results to feed in the MSP discussions and the upcoming revised MSPs from some member states. So again, sorry for being a bit long. I will just conclude by highlighting 3 points that I think are crucial in this discussion. First, I think we need to ensure strong regional planning and coordination going towards regional MSP. Second, I think a good understanding of impacts and innovative solutions that we have in our toolkit is also key. And here, research and innovation plays quite a significant role. And last but not least, early and meaningful stakeholder engagement is also a crucial component. So thank you very much. And I give back the floor to Thorjørn.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Eloïse. Thanks also to the questions that is coming in the Q&A box. Several good points there to pick up in the discussion later on. But I think for now we just move on to the next introduction, and that would be by Antonia Leroy from WWF European Policy Office. She is an optimist apparently, because she will talk about nature-friendly deployment of offshore renewable energy. Yes, we can. Antonia, please.
Thank you, and good morning, everyone. So, indeed, I'm an optimistic, but let's see how we can do it, because there is some challenges on the way. So I think the targets were quite well recalled in our presentation, but if we are to limit 1.5, we need to be climate neutral by 2040 on our side. I know we have 2050 target to be climate neutral, but for us it needs to be 2040. And we know that this long-term trajectory requires 30% of offshore wind by 2050, which is currently 20 times the time of offshore wind capacity today. But the expansion of offshore wind, if we want to be coherent in terms of policy, must be done in a way that protects our ocean and its ecosystem, which is currently not the case. So maybe I will move quicker on this slide, because I think most of the speakers have already spoke about it, but maybe a fun fact, if member states deliver on the promise they made in 2023, the EU will already surpass its 2050 goals in 2030 for the North Sea and the Baltic, we find out. So the targets were also mentioned, but there is also other sources of ocean energy technologies, such as waves and tidal, which are currently maybe more like pilot project or little project, but it could also help this ocean energy transition. So this is the potential for offshore, because if we look at the ocean, if the seabed is really deep, it's more complicated to put offshore wind farms. So also in terms of wind, so the potential is mostly, we can see in the north. And currently, as we have seen as well in other presentation, is the leading region for deploying the capacity in offshore wind. Just moving that to So, but we need to ensure policy coherence when we deploy offshore wind in coherence with the Green Deal. So this was a bit of a chart that we did internally to look at nature as well when we deploy offshore wind. But a lot were mentioned, but there is also the Common Fisheries Policy, Bird and Habitat Directive, which is a big link, how we protect the species. Maritime Spatial Planning, of course, this is the main one, but other. So it's where I may be optimistic, or like it's a rule. We cannot address one crisis without addressing the other. That's why we really need nature-friendly deployment of offshore renewable. And we need to really think this seriously. These crises are intertwined. We should not make the mistake of the past to just look at one thing, but really to be coherent and to have this holistic view and to leave no one behind. But good news, we have some solutions. So we'll explain some of them and discuss their implementation. So an ecosystem-based approach to maritime spatial planning, to align the offshore renewable target with also the target of the biodiversity goals, the 30% and 10% strict protection. The pre-select sites that are not sensitive from nature, to organize site-specific tender for offshore renewable energy projects, to include at least 30% of non-price criteria in tender for offshore wind. Some countries are starting to include much more, so to not only base offshore wind deployment on price, to improve the compatibility between data and non-price criteria of projects across border, also for the industry to decrease their burden and investment. Collaborate at regional level to ensure the impact on infrastructure are monitored, but also the good environmental status of the sea is achieved, because we are far behind. Now what we see, which approach in terms of maritime spatial planning, for instance, that will be good to take when we speak about ecosystem-based approach, is a precautionary principle, is policy coherence. It's really looking also as protected area, to transparency, participation of stakeholder, monitor the environmental impacts, because it's not really old technologies in a way, and to have a long-term vision on sustainable blue economies with climate change, climate adaptation, and all these scenarios that could happen in the future. So I will skip this video. But now speaking about the reality, so this is good, we speak about policy coherence, but when authorities need to implement it, it's not happening. So this is an assessment we have done of all sea basin on maritime spatial planning. It was distinguished in 4 categories: consideration of nature, comprehensiveness, socioeconomic impacts, and others. And we see that member states are not walking the talk. In terms of offshore renewable, designation of area, sometimes in some countries like participation, while we see currently that we have enough space for the 2030 target for most of the countries, but in terms of nature inclusion, we're not there. So I wanted to show you a bit the main impact of offshore renewable energy on marine ecosystem, because currently we are not reaching the good environmental status of our seas. I think it was a bit mentioned before, but yeah, it's a chart we have been developed in terms of noise, in terms of also, light pollution, blue, we call it blue corridor, but marine mammal corridors pretty much, or bird corridors. This is not enough, so true. And while we have mitigation technologies, but also we can avoid before we mitigate. So then I wanted to discuss non-price criteria, because we think here in practice is where we can also look at the holistic view on how we deploy offshore renewable. To have a centralized approach in tendering process, so pre-select sites that are the least sensitive for nature-based solution, site-specific tender, full use of the at least 30% of non-price criteria, guideline to harmonize also environmental and social criteria available for member states to be able to learn from best practice and exchange. Of course, there is no one size fits all, but there could be a bit of an harmonized baseline. A monitoring system and evaluation to measure the environmental impact along the time. And so what this kind of indicator could look like: biodiversity protection and restoration, which currently is not really the case, energy efficiency, co-location of renewable infrastructure, because we don't really speak about multi-use, but we should it more, especially if we want a good maritime spatial planning process. Circularity, eco-design, social equity and benefits, and multi-use I already mentioned. So I will go past quickly this, but we have some case study on Spain, for instance, that in some contexts they have 75% of non-price criteria, environmental, social and governance criteria. We have Belgium also that have non-price criteria on noise, cable, protection of habitat and migration route of marine fauna. And this was developed in collaboration with also the NGO, civil society, as per SPEN. So it was really a success. We have also Germany. We include a lot of non-press criteria, but some could be amended. Again, the impact on ecosystem. And I want to raise here that sometimes, indeed, there could be benefit of pushing an offshore wind farm to have more oyster farm or mussel farm. There could be like multi-use, but for us, it's not restoration. Put in a wind farm, if you have oyster or whatever that aggregate to it, which is the case at sea, you put anything, most thing aggregates. It doesn't mean that the life expectancy of this species with vibration noise will be longer. We don't know which kind of ecosystem will have been there if there will not have been offshore wind farm. So it's all discussion. So we really want to avoid this narrative of putting offshore wind farm and it's a restoration or protection project in this area. We really want to avoid harming nature and then minimize the harm of nature because it's a human activity where there are human impacts. So next time in terms of policy coherence, this could go well or this could go wrong for us. If offshore wind farm are installed in marine protected area and there is conflict between sea use and sea activities with tourism as well. So we see, for instance, in the Med, the seabed is much more deep. So with really big cement and marine life, that might be a bit more difficult to install offshore wind farms. So we really need to speak with stakeholders and communities to see how we do it. Offshore renewable is not developed yet using eco-design and does not consider most input from stakeholder consultation enough. So the good scenario could be then we really develop the climate target and the biodiversity target together. So we will release soon an assessment in July on do we have enough space for offshore. The preliminary result is yes for now for 2030 target. So could we meet the biodiversity targets that are lacking behind? Because there is definitively, we are definitely really far from reaching the 30 and 10% strict protection. And we need to phase out fossil fuel. So this is the idea of being neutral, but currently we don't see any phase out of fossil fuel. Sometimes we see the opposite. We see solar panel or offshore wind farm put on top of offshore oil extraction, and then they call it climate neutral offshore oil or gas or whatever. So we really also are seeing some greenwashing trends to just add energy production. So just showing a few reports that we have been publishing, recommending how we can do it to develop nature-friendly deployment. Also, we have a series of analysis of maritime spatial planning in the EU, and we work with the industry in a coalition called Ocean, and we all have the same ask. We all need good ecosystem-based maritime spatial planning. And why the industry is also really on our side on that? Because it's a risk, it's a reputational risk for them. They don't lack if we map a MPA as accelerating area pretty much, because they know there will be backlash from people and this could delay projects. So they really want a good maritime spatial planning as possible. So we have organized a big conference in January to also bridge gap between stakeholder, industry, civil society, national governments, between authorities. This was quite of a success and you can read more about and we have recommendation. And that's it for me. I just wanted to conclude on that note that we really continue to work as part of this Ocean coalition with the industry. You can read also our joint ask. We are relying on many, many things. So thank you for that. And if there is any question, I'm available.
Thank you very much, Antonia. I think we just move straight on to the next speaker, and we just made a little bit of a change in the order. So the next one will be Eloïse Belin. She is from DG Environment. And she will speak about how to achieve good environmental status that also can contribute to sustainable use of the seas and EU's policy coherence. Eloïse, please.
Yeah,
Well,
thank you very much.
Just one note to the audience. In the Q&A thing, you can push, if you find a question you like particularly well, you can push that thumbs up and it will get at the top of my list of questions to ask later on. Thank you, Alice.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to speak at this panel. Good morning, everybody, and I'm happy to be here to speak about, let's say, the protection and sustainable use part of the legal framework for marine policy in the EU. First of all, I apologize. I know that you see a gray box at the top of my screen. I try to get rid of it, but I think I cannot. So I apologize for that. You might miss a few titles in the slides. I don't think that makes much difference in terms of understanding what I'm going to talk about. So the legal framework for protecting marine biodiversity in the EU is quite comprehensive, and it dates back to many years, starting with the Birds Directive in the 70s, and especially with the adoption of the Habitats Directive in 1992, it was very much strengthened there. I won't speak much about the Birds and Habitats Directive. I'm going to focus on the Marine Strategy Framework Directive, which is the directive I work on, which was adopted in 2008, and which has as an objective to achieve a good environmental status of EU seas. What is interesting with the Marine Strategy Framework Directive is that it departed from the very focused protection perspective of the Birds and Habitats Directive to include an aspect of a sustainable use. Achieving good environmental status does not mean being in a pristine state of marine seas. It recognizes that human activities are taking place at sea and also on land, that these human activities have impacts on the marine environment, and the aim of the directive is to reduce these impacts to levels where marine life and marine biodiversity and ecosystems can function normally and in the long term, and have a normal functioning and serve and deliver the ecosystem services on which we depend. In 2017, we reviewed the decision on good environmental status, which is a legal act which accompanies the Marine Strategy Framework Directive, and that was an important step in the process of implementing the directive. It was meant to increase coherence between countries in how they assess the state of the sea. So according to the 11 descriptors of good environmental status, which you may be familiar with, which range from protecting biodiversity to a number of pressures, including contaminants, underwater noise, seafloor disturbance, etc. And the decision tried to bring some harmonization and some coherence in how member states are doing this assessment of the state of their seas, and to assess and also how they are defining good environmental status. And in regard with that, one element of this decision is that it requires member states to put in place threshold values for good environmental status, quantitative threshold values. And these thresholds are quantitative boundaries between what is considered to be good status and what is considered to be bad status. So they're meant to represent, let's say, the boundaries of within which we should be organizing human activities, and beyond these boundaries, the ecosystem, the marine environment, becomes impacted and is no longer in good environmental status. This here is meant, I don't know if you can see the title, and I apologize for that. It's meant to show the policy context for the protection of Europe's seas. It might not be fully complete. We try to put in as many, let's say, frameworks as possible. Green represents more, let's say, the environmental, legal and policy frameworks, and on the other side, with the oranges and the blues, you have more maritime economy, let's say, frameworks, which have an impact, obviously, also on the state of the marine environment. The Marine Strategy Framework Directive is here a little bit, put it a little bit in the middle. Interestingly, the Marine Strategy Framework Directive includes as a legal requirement that there must be coherence in how it is implemented with all of these other frameworks. So it's very good that it requires this level of coherence, of policy coherence. It makes things extremely challenging because, as you can see, it's a busy landscape for the protection and the sustainable use of the marine environment. So this is within this landscape that the Marine Strategy Framework Directive is being implemented. Here, I wanted to focus more specifically on the links between the Marine Strategy Framework Directive and the Maritime Spatial Planning Directive. So that's what the title says at the top. And one of the very strong link between the two frameworks is the ecosystem-based approach. We've heard about it now from previous speakers, and Antonia especially has mentioned it a few times. This is indeed for us a very important concept. It is unfortunately a concept that is still difficult to clearly define. It is included in the Marine Strategy Framework Directive. It was the first EU legal act which sets the foundation for the use of the ecosystem-based approach. And I put here the article. I won't read it out loud, but you can see it here. And the link with the Maritime Spatial Planning Directive, which was adopted in 2014, so after the MSFD, is that the Maritime Spatial Planning, as Antonia mentioned, calls for member states to develop their Maritime Spatial Plan in an ecosystem-based approach. And there is a recital in the MSP which links directly the ecosystem-based approach to the definition in the Marine Strategy Framework Directive. One part of that definition, which is very important for us, is that it talks about ensuring that the collective pressure of human activities is kept within levels compatible with the achievement of good environmental status. And by requiring, in 2017, with the decision on good environmental status, by requiring that member states set threshold values for good environmental status, we made these provision more operational in a way. And the ecosystem-based approach should be to ensure that the threshold values for good environmental status are achieved and maintained through the planning of human activities at sea and also on land in some cases, in a way that it supports the achievement of these values. I just wanted to mention in the context of the Green Deal, additional initiatives that play a role, let's say, in how we are thinking about the protection and the sustainable use of the marine environment. Two strategies in particular that were adopted following the adoption of the Green Deal. One of them is the Zero Pollution Action Plan, which has a vision for 2050 that air, water, and soil pollution should be reduced to levels that are no longer considered harmful for health and for natural life. And it sets a number of targets. Some of them are related to land-based activities. Some of them are very much strongly linked to the marine environment, such as those in plastic litter or microplastics, nutrient losses, and they are also mentioned in the Zero Pollution Action Plan about underwater noise. So there are very strong links with the objectives of the Marine Strategy Framework Directive. Although the Marine Strategy Framework Directive doesn't include specific targets in terms of pressure reduction, and rather a state that needs to be achieved with the threshold values for good environmental status, but the targets of the Zero Pollution Action Plan basically can contribute to going towards good environmental status. And the second one, and there are more strategies and policies under the Green Deal, but I'll just focus on these two ones. The second one is the Biodiversity Strategy for 2030, which was adopted in May 2020, and which aims to put biodiversity on the path of recovery and rebuild resilience of ecosystems. Sorry, not marine, not just marine, all of them. And it has two components. It has a sort of a protection part and a restoration part. And the protection aspect sets a number of targets, but very much strongly building on existing legal frameworks, including the Marine Strategy Framework Directive, but also birds and habitats, obviously. And when it comes to the restoration part, the biodiversity strategy sets the grounds for a proposal for a nature restoration law. And I saw in the Q&A that there was a question about the state of the nature restoration law proposal. As you know, the Commission proposed the law in June 2022, and it's been going through interinstitutional discussions since then. We all know that these discussions are difficult. We are still hoping that the nature restoration law, as agreed by Council and Parliament, will be adopted soon. And indeed, the adoption of the nature restoration law is a new element into this complicated policy landscape that I showed before, which will give new impetus for taking concrete measures for protection and restoration of marine ecosystems. It is very strongly linked to the Marine Strategy Framework Directive, and we can see the two frameworks working very closely together. So let's see what happens there, but we remain optimistic. On the current framework, I just wanted to share some concluding thoughts. So just to say that, again, the MSFD is not just about protecting marine life and marine biodiversity, although that's a very important part of it, but it is also about using marine resources sustainably. Again, good environmental status is not meant to be a pristine condition. It is meant to accommodate a certain level of use of the marine environment, but our ambition is to define the limits above which marine ecosystems become impacted and can no longer function normally and provide ecosystem services. I'll try to be quick, but I just wanted to say a few words on the fact that we are in the process of reviewing the Marine Strategy Framework Directive. It is a requirement in Article 23 of the directive that we should evaluate and review the directive by July 2023. We're a bit late, but we're working right now on the evaluation of the directive. So how well did it function? This is a backward-looking exercise. Did it achieve its objective? And if not, what were the reasons, the factors for not achieving those? And we do this looking at 5 criteria: effectiveness, efficiency, relevance, policy coherence, and EU added value. And then in a second stage, we will be carrying out an impact assessment to try to assess the environmental, social, and economic impact of different options for a possible review of the directive. I say possible because obviously whether the directive will be opened and reviewed or not depends on the outcome of the impact assessment. There was a question in Fraukje's presentation earlier about are the Birds and Habitats Directive and the MSFD strong enough to accommodate these new challenges that we're seeing, in particular regarding the development of renewable offshore, but not just that. There are many human activities taking place at sea and developing. There are very good and strong elements in the Marine Strategy Framework Directive, but we see that there is an inadequacy in the legal framework itself, in how the law is phrased and the vagueness of some of its provision. That means that all of the very strong and science-based work that is being done to implement the directive can sometimes come to an obstacle in terms of enforcing it really on the ground. So this is something that comes out of the evaluation, and that if we have the opportunity to open the directive, we would like to try to strengthen. There are also a number of inefficiencies in how regional cooperation is taking place, although it's a very strong component of the implementation of the MSFD. coherence with other legislation and policies, and especially based on this new context of the Green Deal and the deployment of offshore wind and possibly nature restoration law. There are a lot of things to be taken into account if we review the directive, and also issues related to data management and data flows. So the objectives that we are setting ourselves for this revision mirror the let's say the challenges that we have identified during the evaluation. Obviously, we want to achieve a better protection of the marine environment, which enables the sustainable use of EU seas in the context of the European Green Deal. And the objectives, as I said, they mirror what the challenges that we noted before. I'll stop here because I think I already took quite a bit of time, but happy to get your questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Eloïse. Questions keep coming in. That's good. And you also touched upon a couple of them when you were talking now, so that was very good. We'll take the last presentation before we move into some questions and discussion. The last one will be from Céline Frank. She's in DG MARE, and she will talk about marine spatial planning and how that can support the Green Deal objectives for biodiversity and offshore renewable energy. Celine, please.
Thank you, Thorjørn. Thank you for having me. And I'm actually really happy because pretty much all the speakers in this panel already mentioned MSP and talked about MSP. So it does not only mean that my presentation can be short, but also that everybody has understood the importance of MSP in this context, from stakeholders to NGOs to scientists, and also to the different ministries and departments at national and EU level.
Celine, you are not sharing the presentation. We just
this is coming.
You know, okay.
This is coming. Yeah, is it right now?
Yeah, it's good. You also have the gray boxes, but that's something we need to live with, I think.
Yeah, I don't know if I can get rid of it. Sorry for that. Yeah. Hopefully it doesn't come too much on top, but I will explain the title if needed.
Yeah, go ahead.
This picture shows a bit the work that we have been doing, let's say, over the past 10 years since the adoption of the directive in the EU on maritime spatial planning. So we've been funding a lot of projects with our European Maritime and Fisheries and Aquaculture Fund since the adoption and even before the adoption of the directives. So projects to support member states to have a plan in place, and also, and most importantly, to cooperate together when they work on a national maritime spatial plan. Because the idea is really, at the end of the day, to have an overview and a good planning at sea basin level, with the support of a regional organization active in the different sea basins. Maybe I can get rid of this one already. And so also through these projects and all the works we've been carrying on MSP in the past 10 years and more, we have created a proactive and engaged MSP stakeholder community and a point of reference on MSP practice in the EU, but also worldwide, through notably our EU MSP platform online, where you can find all information about the implementation of the directive, but also projects, exchange of data, groups that are active on MSP. So I strongly suggest you to have a look. And another good news, so we almost have all member states who have adopted their plan, and globally 90% of the nationally adopted plans are located in EU countries. So we're really at the forefront of planning the seas in the EU. We had our first implementation report in 2022, which highlighted the need for MSP to become more regional, as I say, but also more digital, and to tackle better the Green Deal objectives. Most of the plans were adopted before or when the Green Deal was coming in, so don't yet reflect all these objectives, as Antonia also pointed out. But we are working on that together with member states, and several of them are revising their plan, notably to accommodate the increased objective of the offshore wind developments. On MPAs, there is currently a limited forward-looking perspective in the plans, but we have some commitments for the member states who are actually currently adopting their pledges in the framework of the biodiversity strategy, to, when these pledges are adopted, to include them in their plans. And also, when we speak about multi-use, it was also mentioned by different speakers. This is something we encourage, notably with our blue economy strategy, so to have more sectors working together at sea. And there is not so many areas identified for that yet in the current plans, but there will be more in the updated plans. And we also see more and more pilot projects all across the EU, so that's very positive. MSP, it's a lot about maps, so I will show you maps. We have also a European Marine Observation and Data Network that is very important for a lot of data on the seas in the EU, and it's also used for MSP. Now we have 10 plans uploaded in it. We need more of them, so we are working together with member states to do this data transferability to EMOD-NET, and to have them also. We can have this picture at regional and EU level on EMOD-NET. Just a few plans to show you a bit where and how member states consider renewable energy and nature protection in their plans. This is Denmark, and just a picture of where the existing and then the future renewable energy are going to be. So quite big areas identified. It doesn't mean that all these areas will be filled with MSP, but they were, with offshore wind, but they were identified as good areas for that, for these developments. Also another example with Poland, with the full picture on the left, with all the activities, also the maritime corridors, and in green the protected areas, while I made a close-up on the offshore wind areas identified for developments. We have now a multi-use compendium online, so as I said, something we encourage, and now we want to showcase all the best practices that exist in Europe. And in certain areas with limited space, they will need to become the norm. Certain combinations obviously are more feasible or easy than others. So for example, we see a lot of aquaculture projects being developed in offshore wind farm. We see less of that with fisheries, for example. And we know also that having MPAs and offshore wind areas coexisting will be a challenge, but it will happen in certain areas. Yet we will have also these 10% of strictly protected areas with obviously no multi-use. A few initiative, knowledge, practices on MSP that I wanted to share. So some I mentioned already. We will see also more and more multi-technologies, multi-use developing at sea. So it's about floating solar panels, but also wave energy, tidal energy, and floating wind. Some people mentioned already non-price criteria, so I will not say too much on that. We also have, as I said, a growing community working on MSPs, and several communities of practices developing. So we have one in the North Sea, in the Baltic, also in the Med, specifically experts working on MSP. We also launched last year a Blue Forum for users of the sea, which is really there to put different sectors, activities, stakeholders together at the same table and discuss, and that really supports the planning, member states planning. Yeah, the Coalition for Energy and Nature was mentioned by Antonia already. So it's also a strong asset to have the industry working on these issues already upfront. Obviously, we need more data. As this was mentioned, knowing better the impact is very important. The European Environmental Agency published a report in 2022, which is a big review on mapping the potential environmental impact of offshore renewable energy. It's quite complete, so I also recommend to check that out. But obviously the research continues, notably with the support of Horizon Europe. Yeah, just to mention as well, MSP, it's a lot about stakeholder consultations already. So it's a long process. It involves sometimes hundreds of consultations with stakeholders. And we are actually now, we just launched a study to look at all these consultations, how the results are taken into account or not by the different countries. We have projects, several projects funded by NFAF, as I mentioned, cooperation project on MSP. So there is one working on the region's involvement because, as you know, MSP is really a national process, but also the regions have their own planning, and we try to see regions and even also at a more local level. So we try to see how these different levels interact. There is a specific project, MSP Green, looking on actually what we are talking about today, so how the Green Deal objectives are and will be included in the revised national maritime spatial plans. We also see that MSP is becoming a tool for ocean literacy, and that's a very, I would say, positive development, because by making maps, by making scenarios of what is going to happen to your sea, to the seas, and then having those consultations with a large public, countries really have to work on their communication. And that's, we really see a very good development in several countries on how to do that, use the best tools and visualization methods to do that. And also participative approach with stakeholders. We do a lot also on data. So I also already mentioned the ModNet and what we do to improve data sharing, harmonization of data, and the usage of data from MSP. We have an expert group on that as well. Yeah, this is to show you a bit what kind of work can be done at regional level. So here in the North Sea, on the interactions between offshore energy, the environment, and also shipping. And this also thanks to the data publicly available on EMODNet. So you can see the circled area that are hotspots of biodiversity, and how, yeah, this was put into perspective to create scenarios for the North Sea, also considering offshore renewable energy developments. So a few next steps and activities on our side. So I mentioned them. We have currently 3 MSP cooperation projects ongoing, and which will deliver this year. We will also launch 2 new ones very soon. So we've been these projects being very essential to not only to the deployment of the plans, but also for this cooperation and regional perspective on planning. MSFD review, Alice explained you everything about it, but we want to look into this to increase coherence and harmonization in planning. The second report of the MSP directive implementation is expected by 2026, so we're already starting to look into that. I can also mention the common fisheries policy being under evaluation right now. And so this, obviously, we will also look at coherence with all these other policies that were mentioned today. And finally, an announcement. We're going to celebrate the 10 years anniversary of the MSP directive this year. And that will happen as an MSP week in October, the 3rd week of October in Marseille. So I hope to see some of you there. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Celine, and thanks to all of you for very interesting introductions. A reflection from myself. I think now we have heard from many different angles on the challenge we all agree that we have, that there are, say, conflicting interests between developing more offshore wind energy and protecting biodiversity and ecosystems. But I still think it's good to hear that there is quite a bit of agreement on what are the challenges. So I would like to start with challenging our two scientists here, and also Antonia from WWF. Now you have heard from 3 different directorates. I think they all acknowledge the challenges you have pointed to. Do you think we are moving in the right direction with moving towards more coherence from different sectors? Fraukje first, maybe.
Yeah, I can start first by saying thank you to all the panelists for extremely good presentations and a lot of new insight. So my overall impression is that a lot is going on within the field of offshore wind energy. So there are high-level groups, there are plans, there is so much going on. But in the area of marine protection, not a lot has happened since we adopted the European Green Deal and the biodiversity strategy. So I feel that there is a bit of an imbalance between the progress we are making towards renewable energy goals versus the progress we are making towards the biodiversity protection and restoration goals. So this, I think, we might have the regulatory tools in place, we might have all the right directives, but there is also like a political force in place that sometimes is a barrier to move forward with getting in place the regulatory tools and getting policy coherence between biodiversity, for instance, and offshore wind energy. So that's kind of my overall impression, and it's kind of concerning to me to see that what has happened in the last year in specifics.
Judith?
Yeah, indeed. Thank you all. It's very nice to hear all these developments, but also how these developments are actually all the cross linkages between your presentations and how well you know each other already actually, and then what's going on in terms of MSFD revision processes, MSP updating of plans, and then renewable energy development. So that's encouraging. I was wondering, this is of course all happening at the European level, so there seems quite some coordination and at least potential to build coherence, enough coherence at the EU level. I was wondering how that's going on at the regional and member state level, because I think in the end that's where implementation needs to happen. And also given, of course, the time that we still have, if 2030 is our first signpost of whether we can achieve offshore renewable energy targets, and then, to what extent are there similar processes going on at regional and member state level?
Antonia? Antonia, please go ahead. You just need to unmute. Yes.
Yes. Thank you, and thank you for the question. What I see, I mean, we are moving in the right direction. There is more and more openness on MSP to have both processes coming together to meet climate and biodiversity goals. But still, and I think it was mentioned by Fraukje, I think there is imbalance between priority and political will. We have been said, at least at sea, and sometimes maybe the sea is a bit the overlooked issue compared to the land, and we have a bit of an issue because we have centralized tools that are maybe more at ease to deploy renewables than inland, and we have this MSP process, and we have been saying like we need stakeholder consultation. We need to take 1 or 2 more years sometime to ensure that we don't harm biodiversity and to plan it well, but there was political priorities to just move forward. But now that we have zones that are quite defined for 2030, we just need maybe to reflect a bit and to take the time and to not just be driven by political force sometimes. I see one priority among another. And I'm seeing in some forum this question like, oh, could we meet our climate goal with the biodiversity goal? I mean, it's still a question, and for us the answer is yes, of course, but you need the political will to do that. And indeed, I think sometimes it's still a bit imbalance.
Thanks. We'll move to a few of the questions from the listeners. And I think maybe first the three of you from DGs can comment. And we start with the one on pointing towards regional MSP plans and how this can be implemented on a sea basin level, and especially as if it is not challenging to work within EU itself. We also need to deal with a lot of other countries such as Norway and UK and so on. So can you comment a bit on where you are regarding collaborating on the basin scale?
Celine, do you want to come first, or I can give a few preliminary remarks and then you complement. On regional cooperation and regional MSP, as I mentioned in my presentation, this is something that we very much encourage and we try to push towards. Of course, maritime spatial planning remains a member state's competence. So we don't have, as Commission, the power to enforce legally binding requirements regarding regional MSP. But at the same time, we try to support this in various fora and also with third countries. I can speak from the energy side regarding the North Sea and the Baltic Sea, which are, as I mentioned, front runners when it comes to deployment of offshore renewables. We have the UK and Norway, which are, of course, key to these sea basins. And they are very much included in our discussions, especially in high-level groups, so the NSEC for the North Sea and BEMIP. Norway is a member and observer of both those groups, and the UK closely cooperates under a specific MOU, a UK NSEC MOU, for instance. And then I'm sure Celine will complement on MSP regional groups. I just wanted to raise maybe before giving you the floor a recent initiative that has been launched last year around the North Sea, which is called the Greater North Sea Basin Initiative, and which is basically well, a member state initiative initially launched by the Netherlands and France, and which try to provide a regional platform for spatial integration of all users. So basically fisheries, energies, environment protection, and so on, to make sure that we have everyone around the table, and to also provide a regional political impetus regarding this question. So I just wanted to comment on the fact that the imbalance that you maybe raised is, I think, well, evolving a bit, especially in the North Sea, where we have this new political impetus to look at everything at the same time. But Celine, please.
Eloise, can I also ask you to comment on the Baltic Sea? That was another question on the same topic.
Yes, I think the question was regards to the HELCOM and VASAB MSP working group. If we foresee any legally stronger joint planning, and here, as mentioned, as Commission, we don't have the legal basis to do so. This is very much of a member state's competence, so we work closely with member states and this regional HELCOM VASAB working group on MSP to facilitate communication, to support technical work and allow for such regional planning. But yeah, as mentioned, no legal obligation foreseen at the moment.
Yeah. Okay, thanks. Celine.
Yeah, thank you, Eloïse. I think you already answered quite a lot to this question, but yeah, just to complement, indeed, regional cooperation has been so far more sectorial, let's say, in its approach. Now we are really trying with MSP to bring this multi-sectorial ecosystem-based approach also in the regional cooperation. And indeed, notably with the Regional Sea Convention, we see, like HELCOM VASAP, that there are groups within the Regional Sea Convention that are working on MSP and also on looking at sectors and the impacts of these sectors on the environment. So this is very positive, and there is more dialogue. Eloïse mentioned the Greater North Sea Basin Initiative, and it was really at the core of this initiative to say, okay, we have all these objectives. What do we do? How do we make sure that they all happen together? And what are the structure in place that we can use to do that? And the Regional Sea Conventions are often a good tool. In addition to that. So it's for example OSPAR for the Greater North Sea Basin Initiative, and in addition to that, we also have in DG MARE launched some sea basin strategies that you might know. So there is one in the West Med, one in the Atlantic, and also in the Black Sea. So just to support more cooperation on all blue economy sectors, and that includes also maritime spatial planning. So yeah, it's difficult because most of the policies so far were quite sectorial. So MSP is quite cross-cutting, but most policies are being sectorial. Then the cooperation mostly happens or have been happening at sectorial level, but there is this realization that we need also to have this view and to make the different sectors working together. And then one final point on the political willingness that was mentioned, and why the biodiversity takes more time. And I think there's also, I can agree with you on that, but there's also some practical reason for offshore renewables, is that these projects, they take years to be developed. So if you have objectives by 2030, you have to move very quickly. And that all the member states understood, I think. So that's why they were like, okay, it takes at least 5 years to put our turbines in the water. If we don't start now, there's no chance we're going to reach these objectives. It doesn't justify the fact that all the member states are late with their pledges on nature, but it explains also why it was so fast on offshore renewables. Thanks.
Thanks, Alice. I would like to challenge you to reply to another question that was quite popular, and that's the one on offshore energy projects within marine protected areas and positions there, or who has what position on this item that I assume is rather controversial several places.
Right. Thanks for that question. And I'm not necessarily the best placed to answer that, as it's more my colleagues who work on the Natura 2000 network and the implementation of the Habitats Directive that have been dealing with this. I believe that in general, marine protected areas is a very broad term for many different things. So I would say, first of all, that it really first depends on the conservation objective of the site that you're designating. Why are you designating this particular area? What are you trying to protect with this particular area? It also depends, I would imagine, on the legal framework under which you're doing this, with certain legal frameworks which are, stricter than others, where you really have to assess the impacts of any human activities that are taking place within the MPA, and whether this would have consequences on the conservation objectives. And we've heard before that in any case, in these areas that you want to strictly protect, and here the Commission has published a guidance document on how to designate strict protection areas. It is clear that activities like offshore wind energy would not have their place in there. This is a bit of a broad answer, and I am not giving a clear yes, you can have them in there, and no, you can't, as you could have expected from me. But yeah, I think it, MPAs is a broad term. It encompasses a lot of different things. In general, in any case, MPAs are there to protect marine biodiversity. So the question is how you can make that work with human activities that take place in there.
Thanks. Then as the final from the list of questions, I would like to come back a little bit to the nature restoration law that did not happen, but still the need for restoration and opportunities for win-win projects. Does offshore wind development have a role to play in helping restoration happen? Antonia first, maybe. Do you believe that is possible, or is it greenwashing, as you maybe indicated earlier?
Yeah, so it depends what you speak about. If you speak about the area, I will never define an offshore wind farm area as a restoration area for sure. But in some dead zone, if they speak with Fisher, for instance, yes, they could try to put offshore wind farm and have a bit of mollusks aggregated, and it's still, more lives than it was before because it was a dead zone. So in some contexts, they could help to restore a bit nature, but I will never consider that as a restoration area. Where they could help is when they have avoid everything, but still it's a human activity, so they have a bit of an impact and they could mitigate. And here they could help in terms of compensation, to really look at restoration project. And we do that with the industry. We speak with them, and sometimes they're really willing to help, to compensate a bit, or if they win a tender and there is like non-press criteria about restoration and biodiversity, they will need to make effort, but maybe outside the area as well, because the sea is connected with some species. So it's how maybe with the profit as well, they can help fund restoration and ensure connectivity in this.
Thank you. We are about to round off, but I would like I think all of you, all the panelists, to have a short final reply. What do you think are the most important next step to do now when we're talking about offshore wind and biodiversity and the challenges we have been discussing? Antonia, please.
Thank you. So the really first ask that we have also with the industry is like a good MSP process, a better ecosystem-based management MSP process. So member states need to review the copy and to include the pledges and to do it well.
Thank you.
And I can only agree with that.
Very good.
That's, I would say, yeah, this good ecosystem-based climate-proof planning, and also implementation of all fields of the Green Deal.
Alice?
Yeah, I mean, I was going to say ecosystem-based maritime spatial planning, but to complement a little bit what we think is ecosystem-based, and here I will link to what we do in the Marine Strategy Framework Directive and the threshold values for good environmental status. Respecting these boundaries is extremely important to make sure that we sustainably use our seas.
Eloïse?
Right, I can only agree with my fellow panelists. Regional MSP and well-established planning is really key. I think also there's a strong importance of innovation and research. We see some new projects with new technologies to try to foster biodiversity protection and restoration. For instance, Elia, the Belgium TSO, is currently developing this Princess Elizabeth energy island and has quite some interesting solutions to do that. And I think projects need to learn from each other, and we need to continue to support research and innovation to support those win-win solutions.
Thanks a lot, and I think that was a very nice final remark. It fits it so well, so one could suspect that I actually asked you to say that, since we actually are talking about research projects. So thank you very much. Thanks to all the panelists, to the project leaders and scientists, and to all of you participating in this roundtable webinar. Thank you very much, and hope to see you again somewhere else next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
You.